we've identified in part one is the separation between the front end and the back end. So the front end, as we talked about, we dived into a little bit of the differences between async, defer, DOM content loaded, and we've concluded that for the purposes of what we need today and what we kind of need throughout just like this school experience is that if we put the script inside the head tag, we can then just defer the execution of the script so that all of the HTML is available to us, right? And we no longer really need this DOM content loaded if that's the way we choose to handle it. We can tell that the way we're pulling in the script is just the name of the file so that it's going to go and download that script tag. And now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be in part two building out this HTML, pulling data from the back end. So let's take a look at what we built for the back end, right? This is flavor 2 because the first thing we built was flavor town, which is flavor 1, which had no dash API. It built regular Rails. I used scaffold, and then we created a couple items, and then we saw the difference between asking for HTML and then asking for JSON. Here, what we're doing is, in the routes, we talked about custom routing, making sure it hits the correct controller action. We also talked about using namespaces that allows us to go to the correct controller at that action. And so right now with this, we've actually built all 7 RESTful routes. We're going to talk about the 7 RESTful routes in this part 2. And then inside the controller, what we've identified is we can either do the nachos controller like this, or we can use version control by going into and creating an API v1 version of our controller. Here we've just built out index. So surprise, surprise, we have a couple of more controller actions to build in order to hit the rest of that CRUD functionality. In here, we talked about the serializers in the way that it could shape our data. If we have a user and a user model, we don't necessarily want to send every single attribute, right? We don't want to send the password hash over. We maybe not want to send if we're, like for example, I work for the VA, and inside your user model, there's a lot of sensitive data, right? Like in the user model, I'm storing potentially some of the digits of your social security number. I'm storing your birthday, and that's not data I want to send over the internet all the time. So I want to shape my data. So maybe on certain requests, I just send the ID, I just send the name, and I just send the email. And the way I do that is through a serializer. Inside my serializer, we use the fast JSON API serializer, and we've talked a little bit about how that's just faster than the active model. And then inside the serializers, we talked about specifying what attributes you actually want to send over. All right, and so that kind of encompasses everything we did in part 1. So now part 2, based on the fact that our Rails backend is sort of built, we actually need to make additional fetch requests to create additional functionality, and then we need the full CRUD action. So let's dive right in. All right, are there any questions as to like what we covered for part 1?
Wait, can you explain the nachos controller one more time?
The pieces in the nachos? Okay, great. The nachos control, okay, this one, right? So the question is like, what's going on, right? This is pretty simple, right? At nachos, nacho.all. I don't feel like I should explain that part. The idea here is that the nacho serializer, if we look at the fast JSON API, right, we can take a look at what that is doing. So the idea is, all I did was I added the gem, I bundled install, I created a new serializer, and I named it after the model that I wanted to serialize. So before I was sending over ID, name, cheese, created that, updated that, literally every attribute inside my database. But I don't want to do that. What I'd rather do is if I do Rails G serializer, I need to tell it what attributes to send over. So if I look at my serializer, I just want to send over cheese, which is what the class wanted to do, right? Is this nacho cheesy, true or false? So if I take a look at it, all it's going to send over is true or false. But in my controller, what I need to do is actually run the serializer. If I wrap my object, right, here we could see I have nachos. I have to run the nacho serializer. I have to create a new one, passing in all the nachos. That way the serializer is going to take every single attribute and pluck out only the ones that I want. I'm going to send that in serialized JSON, and I'm going to store that into a variable so that when I render JSON, I am no longer doing at nachos, which is every single thing with all the attributes. I'm instead sending over the serialized data. All right? And the way that looks is, hopefully my Rails server is still up, and it is. Well, it's been up the whole time, embarrassing. Localhost 3000/nachos.
It's the V1.
Oh yeah, you're right. Oh my God, no route matches to get to not because it was Benny or it was API v1 nachos. How fast we forget. Those Rails errors. Bless up. And now I'm only sending the cheese attribute. So if we were to literally do, I also want to send over the name attribute. Like let's just say your model had more than 2 attributes. If you refresh, it will send over the according attributes that you specify. Yes?
So with the backend stuff, all of that, like all that's doing is sending stuff to the front end to utilize and display on the page.
That's exactly correct. The backend is just shaping the data, doing the business logic to send to the front end in a nice little package, so the front end can then create the user experience, the HTML, the CSS, and using JavaScript to make the requests, to slap it on the DOM.
I have 2 questions. Is serialization going to be on the
I don't want to tell you whether or not serialization will or won't be on the code challenge. The idea is simply that you can shape your data using serializers, and if you ever forget, even the walkthrough that I did in the video, the documentation on it is so good that it's like, hey, use this gem, don't forget to bundle install. If you want a new serializer, Rails G Serializer, your model name. And the idea is what I don't want to do is tell you that it's not on the test or it is on the test so that you wind up studying and focusing on it. Just trust yourself as a developer that if on some sort of deliverable on the code challenge or not, it tells you, hey, you might be sending too much data over. Is there a way that you could send data and your object only these 2 attributes as opposed to all 17? Then you should be like, oh, right, I know there's a way. It's a serializer. Let me look up Rails serializer. You can either use the built-in one, active model serializer, or you can use FastJSON API. Either way, the documentation is very clear, and you should be able to implement that feature. Does that make sense?
So the other question, this is something I came up in the labs. You can see this.
Okay, so the idea is that just like in Ruby, there was something called self, and that had a very weird behavior to it. In JavaScript, there's something somewhat similar but very different, and that is the this keyword. Next week, I will go over it. However, it's not something that I'm going to be testing you on. That I could tell you I'm not going to necessarily test you on, but I will tell you if you do not understand it, you're gonna have a bad time in React. In the same way that in Mod 1, was active record on the test? No, but how much did you use active record in Rails? Okay, if you don't understand it, you're gonna have a bad time, but I can't test for everything. You'll get like an hour-and-a-half lecture on this keyword next week. So we'll get into that at that point. Are there any other questions before we move on? Awesome, so let's do this. Let's actually build out some sort of functionality onto our website because right now it's looking kind of sad. Right now my HTML, right, I have this nacho container. So what I can do is I can have a button and all it says is click me to see the nachos. So if I look at my actual website, okay, there's just way too many of these. Oh man, that's bad. All right, cool, let's open it again. Now I see this button that says click me to see the nachos. But I click it and oh my goodness, nothing's happening. So let's just say the deliverable is you have a button on your page and when you click it, all the nachos should show up. Seems like a fairly straightforward deliverable. So let's think about how we're gonna implement that. The first thing is when you click this button, nachos should show up. Naturally, what's the first thought process there? What, you had a question?
So, yeah, because I know you're going to end the event listener, and I just had a question.
Okay,
about what
very
the
good.
difference between
Okay, so you're talking about like if I put inside this button an attribute of onClick.
Yeah, because I know you can like give that a function, but I don't really understand the difference between that and an event listener.
There is technically a difference between this onClick and adding event listener. However, for your understanding, your purposes, the onClick attribute is sort of a built-in event listener onto this HTML tag. And that is, I can tell this onClick, and I can write the function right here.
Okay.
But for our purposes, and trust me when I tell you, you will use that a lot, specifically in React. But the idea is I just want you to understand events because this is vanilla JavaScript,
Yeah, totally.
and I kind of want to talk a little bit more about events in that way. But onClick will do pretty much the same behavior.
Okay.
Yeah? So I have this button, and when I click it, I want to see all the nachos. So naturally, inside my, can we rename this to, actually, let's just leave it Benny. I like it. Let's do this, right? This is obviously making the request. So what we can do is, let's do this. Ready? Let's talk about process. Ready? So on click, right, something happens. Right? But on click of what? What should we be grabbing here? The button, right? Do I have access to this button right now? How can I get access to the button? I can do that, right? Because it's the only button on the page, and that's the correct justification. So if in the future, let's say I'm going to add more buttons, which I will, what's another way of identifying this exact button then? Right, we're the full stack developer. We affect the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. So I can just simply go ID, and that is going to be, what does this do? Right, show nachos, sure. Show nachos button, right? So if I go here, I can put const, right, nacho button, and that's going to be the document.query selector. Embarrassing, I actually forgot what we named it. What was it? Show nacho, very good. Ironically. So just to make sure this works, because we talked about async, defer, and then DOM content loaded, I messed up? Oh, embarrassing. I should definitely now console log the nacho button, right? If I do this systematically, this is going to help me significantly. This is a skill and a trait you should learn as a developer because this is how good development happens. Look, it's exactly what I think it is, all right, on the console log. So that's correct. Now I can move on. This seems like a waste of time, but there's this idea that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. If you're going step by step, right, if something goes wrong, you could debug it very quickly. Like if I didn't have 11 gorgeous pair programmers here, I would have continued writing all this code, and this would have been null because I forgot this S here, and that would have broke my code. And I would have looked inside the event listener, I would have looked in all this other code, and then realized 10 minutes later that I forgot the S here. But if I test one by one, I can find that error very, very fast. So on that nacho button, what should happen? Right, so on the nacho button, right, when I click it, something should happen. So that click is an event. So I need to be listening for that event. So I'm going to add an event listener. All right, and what's the event? The click, sure. And then it should do something, right? For purposes right now that I can refactor later, I'm going to take this one step at a time. First make it work, then I'm going to make it sexy. So what I'm going to do is actually write the function right in line. And I know this function has to know about the click event. So this is going to receive the event. Do I need a prevent default here? What is that e.prevent default doing?
So a button is assumed to send a post request by default. Oh, only forms?
Forms will send post.
Okay, so buttons are fine without post.
Buttons are fine. Rails, however, when you do button 2, builds a form. That's where the confusion is.
Okay, yeah, so no prevent default.
Yep.
Yes.
There's no real default behavior, right? Because you could see this button is doing nothing.
If you were to write prevent default and you didn't need it,
If I did write something like e.prevent_default, right? This technically won't break anything, but the idea is that you're preventing default for something you don't need to prevent default for. If we start talking about event delegation, where we have the event listener on a parent that's listening for multiple types of children events, the prevent default can have adverse side effects, where the prevent default is preventing the default of something you actually want to happen in any of the children. So don't use it if you don't need it. Okay? So we talked about this, right? Specifically, don't need, right now. So the next thing is, are we 100% sure that this syntax is correct and that I'm getting the event? Okay. I'm just gonna log E, but is E really important to me? No, what's usually important in the event? Kind of like what is it that I clicked on, the target. So target for me is gonna be important. So if I refresh, the target is in fact the button, and that makes sense to me. So I have the button and I have the e.target. What I wanna do now is when that button is clicked, what should happen? Well, I need to grab all the nachos, right? Well, then how can I do that? That's right. Oh my goodness, look at this. It's done for you because of what we did earlier. All right? When I click this, it's gonna fetch. So let me test. Actually, I have to console log, right? I console log the nachos. So far, so good? Sure, absolutely. So the idea is, the idea is that on a click, I have the event. The event itself will be the click. But what did I click on? That's the target, the event's target. And so it's giving me the button, which makes sense.
So yesterday somebody from Encore was telling me that what?
I can't wait to hear this.
That it's good to, let's say, like, we have a whole bunch of nachos and we had a bunch of, like, each one of them had like a clicker who believe this kind of one, that you should put the event listener on the computer for the place where there's on the buttons, and then
Yes.
targeting will, like, find the right one. I'm a little confused about that.
We're talking about event delegation, and I'm going to get to that later. It doesn't make sense right now because I have literally one button, right? You're not going to see too much of a difference. But if I don't get to it, remind me at the end and we'll talk about it, okay? That was actually a very good point. So the idea here is that on this click, it's going to make this fetch, and I want to see this nachos log. So if I click, I see my data, and it's an array of 3 objects, exactly what I think it is. So far, so good. Incremental tests one at a time. So I know I'm moving forward in the right way. So if I know I have the nachos and I see the nacho container, what I need to do is, what do I need to do? What do I need to do with this nacho data based on the deliverable that was asked of me? On click of the button, I should see all the nachos on the page. I actually have all the nachos, but now I need to slap it on the DOM, right? So if I'm going to slap it on the DOM, I can do it a bunch of different ways. I'm going to show you the traditional way, and then I'm going to show you sort of like a much faster way, but there are a bunch of security implications to it, and we'll get to that. So the normal way is that I have where I want to actually add it to, right? Let's assume I console logged and tested that, and it's good to go. Now, what I want to do is I have to create the element. So I'm going to document.createElement. And that's going to be like, let's just say a p tag, right? I'm just going to drop a p tag for it. The problem is, how many nachos are in the nachos object? 0, 1, maybe more than 1. Is it only ever going to be 1 or more than 1? In the nachos object. It could almost always be potentially more than 1. So is there any way I can do this code for each of those nacho objects? I need to create an element for each of them. So my nachos, the array, for each, receives what as an argument? Right, a callback function. So this function, oops, whoa. I need my curly boys, not the square brackets. Embarrassing. Whoop. Cool. This for each has to receive what from the array? One at a time, one nacho. Whoops. Nacho man. And for each of the nachos, I want to create this p tag. So I'm going to do const, right? New nacho element is equal to this p tag. So in this new nacho element, what do I want to change about it? Right now, I literally have an empty p tag that probably looks a lot like this. It's just super empty. I need what to add into it? The inner text of it. So I can do the inner text. Or no. There we go. All right, inner text is a property, not a function. And so inner text is now going to be what? Here's the thing. If we want nacho.name, how are we getting to it? Remember the way the data comes back. Nachos is an array. For each gives me one element at a time. So if I'm in that one element, right, this is the first element, I get attributes, ID, and type. Which one do I want to go into? Attributes. Okay, great. So first thing I need is in the nacho, I'm going inside attributes. All right, and then what am I looking for? Dot name. So how your data is coming back, you need to be aware of. And so with that being said, I wrote a lot of code. Let me test to see if it's working. If I refresh, I see that on click, for each is not a function. What the? Yeah, I'm gonna have to do that. I thought I did though. It's it's an object. It's an object first that then gives me an array. Got it. Unfortunately, I have to go into data. So it's gonna be nachos.data. For each, which is disgusting, but I'm glad we were able to solve that problem. Let's figure it out. Great. Great, there's no wild errors there. But why am I not actually seeing anything? I thought I changed this p tag to the correct inner text. I'm now slapping on the DOM, right? And so where am I slapping it to? Nacho container dot append child using this brand new node I just gave it, new nacho element. And there it is. But I only see 2, but I have 3. Why? Because in my nonsense and haste, the first one is no. So like nothing comes actually up. Right? Remember when I made that first one, like a folio? I was just like, look, there's no validations. I put create, and it just made it. Embarrassing. Is there a what? Yeah, let's take a look at the elements. If I open the nacho container, there is in fact an empty p tag because it's coming up as null.
And then the other thing is, so based on the way we serialized it, we got this hash that had a data object that contained the array. That doesn't seem optimal. Is that how you wanted that to be structured?
When I serialize it, that's the way the serializer formats the data for me. And so you always have to be aware of the shape of the data. I actually wanted it this way because I want you to see that you can't assume what it is. It's always good to look in at it, console log it, and see how we can go through into the attributes that we want. All right? Now, if I did, however, and I'm on the back end, and I did not serialize this, and I simply gave you @nachos, how will that affect the front end?
You get cheese nachos, even if you don't want them to be sent.
Yes, I will get all of the attributes, but more specifically, I will not have to do nachos.data.forEach. The nachos would just be a regular array. So I can just do nachos.forEach, right? Remember like how the data is coming back based on how you're shaping it. Any questions on that? The serializer is changing the shape of the object that I'm sending. Okay, so. Cool.
Does it also increase the speed in which the data is being delivered?
Not necessarily, no. The serializer doesn't increase the speed that it gets delivered. It just, there's processing time that transforms this, and the fast JSON IPA is just faster than the Rails way of doing it. Okay, so now that's just the normal get, right? I now finish my first deliverable. On that button click, things get added to the page. What if I had a form on my page where I can add another nacho? That would make sense, right? Let's build out this like sort of CRUD functionality. So let's actually take a look. Well, what do I really need on my page? Where does this sort of start? If I need a form to add a new nacho, where does it start? Starts in the new .html DRB, or where does it start? The front end or the back end?
I would
Start.
at the back end, so like render the create or make the create action, and then we can see that it works and then work on the front end.
You can do it that way, but for in terms of like the flow, right? It makes the most sense that the front end has it, sends the data to the back end, then the back end creates it, then sends it back to the front end saying, hey, you just made this new thing, right? The request response cycle. So on the front end, what am I missing here? I'm missing the form, right? Who liked form 4? It's pretty nice. Okay, we don't have that here because it's just HTML. But usually people hate it. They're like, form 4, oh, that was whack. It's all right. So I can do form. And where does this form submit to? Do I want the HTML to submit my form, or do I want JavaScript to submit my form? I want JavaScript to submit my form, because if the HTML submits it, guess what it's going to trigger? It's going to do that post request that's then going to redirect the traditional way. So for example, let's just have an input here and then another input, right? This is going to be text and this is going to be submit. Name, submit. I don't think this needs a value. It does. And that is send that data. And this is going to be I don't want to put params. But this is going to be data sent over. And I'm going to leave the value blank. But it's an input, so I can always put placeholder and just put new nacho name. So if I submit, if I refresh, I have a form here, all right, that's just one input for a nacho name and then a submit button. Nothing wild, right? I could put in another input because I need what two things for my nacho? Cheese and a name. If I had built out the validations that says that I need to put in a cheese, this form will always break on me. But because I'm a dirtbag and I have no validations, I could just send the name and it'll create it. Cool? So that being said, let's see what happens when I click this form. Did you see that really fast? Let's take a look at the network tab to see what's happening. If I click this, it looks like it has to re-download these files. It triggers this sort of like full page refresh that Andrew probably talked about. So far so good? But we don't want that to happen.
What is, like, how do you use
The network page looks like this. If I have all, it's going to tell me every single thing that downloads so that I can go to my website successfully. If I hit refresh, notice how it downloads HTML and it downloads this benny.js file, which makes sense because when I do a GET request to index.html, the first thing I have to download is this right here, the HTML document. So I know what to parse and I know what view to build as the browser. Yes? The next thing is, inside my HTML, it says, go download this script tag. So it downloads it. If I have a CSS file with all my styles on it, guess what other file it has to go and download? The CSS file. I can have multiple CSS files. I can have multiple script tags. It's going to tell me everything I downloaded. Also, I don't have any images here. But let's just say I was Instagram. How many images do you think I have to go and download? They'll all come up here on the network tab. I downloaded these 9 images, these 4 script tags, these 2 CSS files. In this order, this is how long it took. Okay, awesome. So, I noticed that it's triggering this full page refresh, but I don't really want that. I need to prevent that somehow. So, what do I want to do? Well, the action says index.html. If I change this to different page, it's going to attempt to post to this different page. So let's actually see what winds up happening. If I click it, oh no, it's going to tell me your file was not found because it attempted to post to front end / different page. All right? Because that's where you told the form to actually go, which we don't want that. So if I don't want HTML to submit this anywhere, theoretically, I can just get rid of this entirely. This HTML, I don't want HTML to submit the form. I want my JavaScript to submit it. So what I can do is I can grab the form, but how do I grab the form right now? Are there any unique identifiers on this thing? And that is no problem, right? And that is new nacho, dang it. Just too much in here. New nacho form. Cool. So I can probably grab it. Where do I want to grab this? Inside the fetch? Inside this event listener? No, I could probably just grab it out here because it already exists on the page. So const, right? New nacho form is equal to, and that is going to be new nacho form. I think that's correct, but there's only one real way to find out. So if I go back to my console and I refresh, there's my form. I know it's the correct one because it actually highlights on my page. Yeah.
So I actually have a question about like the top 2 lines. I was having like some difficulty deciding where to put stuff like that. Like it's already established on the HTML. Is it just good to have everything be global if you're just trying to get something, or should I have just local that function?
If everything is available on the HTML on load, you can grab them all first and store them in this one area.
So leaving them global is like security risk or like a logic?
No, not really.
Or anything? Okay.
No. So I have this new nacho form, right? And what I want to do is I want to wait until what happens with the form. And somebody clicks on it. Right. People don't click forms. They do, but they submit forms. So on this new nacho form, I want to add an event listener. And what is the event? Was it click? Submit. And that's going to do something. And what it's going to do is it's going to definitely receive the event. We know that. Now, if I try to be smart and I console log, right, e.target, let's see what happens. If I click send that data, it looks like something console logs really fast, but then it just sort of refreshes. So if I see a behavior like that, I already know the form is posting somewhere, and I don't want it to do that. So on the form itself, I want to prevent the default action of the form, which is going to be preventing the default. So once I do that, I now am no longer having it refresh, which makes sense because on the submit, the target of the submit is what? The form. Even though I clicked on the input, the event target is the submission of the form. So we're here now, and what do I want to do?
You want to go to the back end and need to create action, because otherwise you're not going to be able to test this.
Right, I need to actually create something in the database. So what information do I want to send to the database? Probably whatever somebody typed in here, right? So what is there exactly? Is it a button? It's the input. Do I have access to this particular input? Where do I have a reference to it right now? I don't. So there's two things I can do. All right. The first thing is, I know the form, I have access to the form, that's e.target. I can simply traverse the DOM and ask it, hey, what's the first thing in here? That's going to be the input. I can just go from the form straight to the input. Or I can grab it again. The choice is yours and yours alone. Right? No? Oh, Legends of the Hidden Temple. It's all right. It's hot and sweaty in here. So the idea is that I can either add an ID on this, ID, right? Legend. And then I can query select it. Do I need to ask the document for this? I can technically ask the form dot query selector for hashtag legend. I do not have to ask the document for every single thing. I don't want to cloud the document with a million query selectors. I just put legend on there because I talked about Legends of the Hidden Temple like an idiot. What's up?
So you said the other way to select that would actually be that target first child.
So let's drop a debugger and figure out what's going on. Why did the debugger not hit yet? Because I didn't click submit, right? So I hit submit. Now I'm in the debugger, so I can go to the console and see what is e.target. That's the form. What is e.target dot, what is it, first element child? And there it is. You could use that just right there. I think you could probably get away with this as well. Yeah, disgusting. Anyways, there's a lot of options to do it, which is why JavaScript is so wild. You just need to get to where you need to go and do what you need to do. How you choose to do it, I leave that up to you. Yeah? But yes, your way, totally viable. Here, what I'm going to do is actually, you know what? For funsies, I'm just going to do it your way. And that is e.target.firstElementChild. So I'm going to get rid of this. Oop. Cool. So who feels comfortable that they can either query select or they can traverse the DOM? All right, good to go. Wow, you guys are surprisingly awake for this temperature. Even I'm hurting. Best practice. Yeah. The idea is that if you go one level, that should totally be fine. Once you start going 2, 3, 4 levels, it becomes dangerous because if any changes happen to your DOM, you've hard-coded where you're going. And so if you're going one level, like first element child, that's fine because this form, realistically, the inputs probably aren't going to change. Right? Like once you've got this form, you're not going to add 4 or 5 inputs into it. But if you do something like first element child dot first element child dot first element child, and you're like hard-coding your path from your target, that becomes dangerous because the DOM is not always going to be exactly what you want it to be. As you start adding stuff onto the DOM, it changes the tree structure. So I would say general rule, go 1, maybe 2 at max. If you start going 3 or 4, query select it. Good question. Right. So we know that this is the input itself, but let's take a look at the input. What attribute about the input do I actually want? Do I want the ID? Do I want the type, the name, the value, or the placeholder? Right, I want the value. Yes, right? So I want the value. Very good. Thank you. I know, I'm hurting too. I appreciate your sensitivity. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is const input value. and I need to test this thing. So I need to then console log the input value. So I'm simply going to go to input, I'm just going to put nonsense, and if I get that absolute nonsense. All right? What I want to point out are some common gotchas. What's up?
And the only reason you're console log is just to check your.
I'm just testing because I'm testing iteratively every step of the way so that I know I'm getting what's correct. Yeah? Here's the deal. What if I did this? Input value. Would this work? Why would this break? E is not defined, right? That's bizarre. So let's do this instead. Let me try doing that nonsense that I try to do. That's const, and that is not show input. Cool. Does the legend exist at this point on line 4? All right? So let me try simply console logging not show input and seeing what happens. Interesting. Let me do this instead. Dot value. Sorry. If I do this, right, what do we think we're going to get? Empty string. Let me explain why. On line 4, I grab legend and I ask for its value. On line 4, the DOM just loaded. It runs through line 1, 2, 3, and 4 and reads the input right as the DOM loads. Has the user typed anything in yet? So when it pulled the value, it pulled it at the time it loaded, which was empty string. So I'm never going to get it. Does that make sense? What I can do is I can do after the user clicks submit, will that input have value?
Yes.
So can I then do not show input dot value? Can I attempt to pull the value at this time? Yes. So where you write your code based on what the user is doing will be important. Where you write your code based on what the user is doing is going to be important, which is why we need callbacks. So somebody asked on day 1, like, why do we need a callback? Well, I have to wait until something happens so then I can then invoke these functions. If I run it whenever I want, it's not going to be what I want it to be at the time that I want it. So let's continue going with Matt's powerful suggestion. And that's no longer important as well. So I console log that input value is good to go, right? And I have the text that I want. So I have the text that I want, and I know what I want to send to the database. How can I make this network request? Fetch. That's right, fetch. Now it becomes important. Where do I fetch to? Well, my front end job is basically over, right? It's like I've got the input, I've got the logic, I've got my event listener, and now I have the data and I need to send it to the back end. The back end is the one that's going to interact with the model, do something with the database, and then send me a response. So we'll figure it out now. We're going to take the role of the back end engineer, and we're going to tell the front end engineer what route they should be sending that to. So if we take a look at our localhost 3000, Rails info routes, which one is going to hit the create action? Which one of these? This one, right? It's the post to /API v1 nachos. I actually misspoke earlier when I said resource gives us all 7 RESTful routes. Notice what resource gives us here. Where is new and where is edit? Why would new and edit not exist in an API-only version of Rails?
Because the front end is going to generate those.
Right, because guess where the form is now? The form is on the front end. There is no form 4. I don't need the new page because the new page just is the form. Does that make sense? So, if I know that I need to hit this create action, and the route is API v1 nachos, I'm simply going to do, what is this? Yeah, actually I'm just gonna copy this. Oh my goodness, they look the same. What's going to be the main difference? It's a post request, not a get. So now we need to talk about all the options that fetch is gonna get. If you forget, where is the Bible for JavaScript? Right. So you could click on fetch, it could tell you about it, or you could use using fetch. And I highly recommend this until you get good with the syntax, you reference it. Look at that. Wowzers. But let's actually talk about the different things that you can do with the post, the fetch request. You have this fetch, and it hits a URL. We have the URL we want, right? Then it takes one large object as the second argument. So fetch's first argument is going to be, where am I going? The second argument is actually going to be one object with a lot of key value pairs. One object with a lot of key value pairs. So I'm actually going to open up the object. And I'm going to put the first key in. The first key is going to be, again, I say first key as in like, this is the first thing I'm doing. As an object, order doesn't really matter. So if I put method, I can tell it to do get, post, put, patch, or delete. So which one are we doing here? Post, right? And remember, these are all key values, so you need to put commas. You could do mode cores, like something we learned about, but here we don't really need to kind of mess with this because on the Rails backend, I put star. I've opened it up to everything. So I don't really need to set the cores here, right? Caching, I don't really want you to worry too much about. Credentials, kind of like, again, I don't really want to worry about too much. The idea is that we need something called headers. So here are headers. Boom. Headers, however, points to not a string, but another object. So I'm going to open it right here. And I'm simply going to put it inline, and then I'm going to space it and make it sexy. So inline meaning the first thing is I have to put content type. This becomes important in a post request because content type is what type of data are you going to send the server? What type of data are we going to send to the server? Text? We want to send JSON, right? We want JSON going back and forth. So we want to let it know that the content type you're about to get, it's coming in hot, some application JSON. I put this comma here because these are just key value pairs. The next thing I'm going to put in is something called accept. If content type is what I'm sending over, accept must be what expecting to receive, what I'm going to accept back as a response. And as we know, our Rails server is going to render what? JSON. So naturally, this should also be. So again, it's just one line. Now I'm going to make it sexy. I'm just going to go this, and I'm just going to do this. So this is why it looks like this at the end. It's just one object with key value pairs. The headers are, hey, I'm going to send you JSON, and I'm expecting JSON back. I will accept JSON as a return response. Any questions on headers, content type, and accept? Method post pretty obvious, so.
What's that application guy doing for JSON?
What this is telling it is there's so many things that are in the web. This happens to be a web application that's going to send JSON, and it's going to receive JSON from an application. So. Actually, this is technically the correct thing. But remember, post, when it finished, there was a comma. And so when headers finish, if I want one more key value pair, I need a comma. This is a very common gotcha if you forget this comma. Another extremely common gotcha is if you put header, not headers, this thing will fail and it will not tell you anything. So I highly recommend just referencing the docs and going character for character. The other thing inside here that's important is don't worry about redirect or refer. That becomes more complicated HTML. But what is the payload? What do you actually want to send to the back end? So let's do this. It's in body, and there's something called stringify. Interesting. So I'm just going to copy it. So I have method, headers, and body. And because I'm going to essentially send the data as JSON, instead of sending it like this, and that is a key followed by some sort of value, I told the server, you're about to get JSON. So I need to change this into JSON. So you do JSON.stringify. And let me show you what that does. And then I will give you a break because it is obnoxious in here. If I have a object, right? If I have a Charles Entertainment, all right, oh, I'm getting tired, man. And this is an object with a key of fun that points to a. All right, I'll play your game. I'll play your game. All right. Oops. Great. So now I see Charles enter cheese because I'm so lit and I'm actually kind of warm. Let's see what happens when we JSON.stringify Charles Entertainment cheese. It just turns the whole thing into strings. So that strings are very easily interpreted by any language, right? They're all like done the same way. That's why this JSON.stringify is working. So if you're going to send JSON to the server and you're going to accept JSON, you have to just turn it back to your regular object. So when you run JSON.parse, this whole thing actually then becomes a JavaScript object again. Hopefully that clarified some things. And so right now what we're going to decide to do is, I'm just going to fix this right here. I'm going to save it. I'm going to leave you all in intense suspense because I need water and I think you guys need a break. So let's take 5. Boop. All right, cool. So the last thing we did before we took that break was we did that JSON.stringify and we saw that it turned this object into one large string. And that's what the JSON is to send over to the server. So let's actually test to see what happens. What I want to do is I want to send over something called best teachers, and it's just going to be a string that says Vera and Chet. Cool? Fine. And Benny. All right. So we got Vera, Chet, and this nebulous person named Benny. Thank you. That makes me feel really good. Nobody said my name. That's okay. And so what we're going to do is we're going to send this. We're going to send this post request to this URL, right? And if we check the back end and we check the routes, we see resources. If we specifically check those routes again, right, we hit a post of API v1 nachos, which is what this fetch is going to do, post of API v1 nachos. It should hit the API v1 nachos controller with an action called create. If I send the post right now, what do you think will happen? It will fail because it will hit the route, it will hit the server, and the server goes, great, I have a route for that. It's going to look in the controller, oh my god, I have a controller for that. And then it's going to look for this. And then it's going to do, oh my goodness, there is no create, gasp. So what's the easiest way to solve that problem? You're just going to create, right? But what I want to do now is actually look to see what's the most important thing that we need to look at inside this create action. What are the params? If only there was some way we can pause the code and check the params. Nice try. It's a bug. I know. When I was teaching mods 1 and 3, I was teaching your class actually. I made a lot of mistakes. Because if you jump between the languages, well, it gets dicey. Anyways, Hello again from Mod 3.
Why can't they just all make it the same?
What a good question. Unfortunately, they were created at different times, and people enjoy proprietary information. So let's do this. We've got the by bug in the create, and we understand that the front end is going to hit this post, and it's going to send this payload over according to the body. When does it actually send? On page load or what? When does it happen? On submit. So let's refresh. Let's type some things in like ye that haw. If I hit send that data, I'm probably going to see a loading screen there, but I'm a tab monster, so I'm sorry. Where would I see the by bug? In the terminal. Gasp, there it is. Wow, powerful. That water really helped. So what am I looking for? And what do I see? Best teachers, Vera, Chet's, and Benny. And Benny, right? That's what the payload sent. Which is interesting because what do I normally do in the create action? You create. Yes, you create. So I can do nacho.create, but should I use params at a key of best teachers? That would be weird, right? I could do create and put name is equal to what? Params at a key of? Well, I mean, it's in different hatch, so it'll work, right? And then guess what? I've just made this nacho with the name of Vera, Chet's, and Benny. Congratulations, you're all nachos. So, if I take a look at my backend code, I can do nacho.create, and I can pass in the name is going to be params at a key of best teachers, blah, blah, blah. But where did best teachers come from? I made it. So if I'm the front end, and I'm also the back end, all right, I can talk to each other and say, what is the key we've decided to use? So what key would you like to use? Sure, name makes sense to me, right? Nacho name? Yeah, sure. I mean, whatever. Nacho.
Sounds like not your name.
Nacho name. And then do I want to hard code the string or like what should this be? What the user typed, right? What the user typed, which we actually, gasp, have access to also. Yeah.
Should we wrap this whole thing in like an object with a key of nacho so that way we can use like getting ahead?
You're getting there, yeah. So if I change this, right, to nacho name with input value being interpolated, then what makes sense is, I should probably continue. If I refresh, if I want to yeet that haw again, if I send the data, oh, did I not save the backend? Oh, embarrassing. Oh, I didn't save the backend. Wow, embarrassing. Great. Refresh. I'm going to yeet that haw, embarrassing. Send the data. And now I'm in the by bug. So what are the params of nacho name? That's what I really want. So if we've decided as a front end, back end team, we've communicated, this is the key that we've both agreed on, then I can probably remove best and I can put nacho name here on the params. Yeah? I can also get rid of the by bug. But let's think through, right? What normally happens in the create? Is it like a render? Is it like a redirect? Or is it a what? There's some sort of redirect, right? But again, we don't want that. We don't want that redirect. We don't want that, like, refresh. But if JavaScript sent a request to create something, I need to send some sort of response. So we talked about this being the model interaction, but what is the response? What should we do? Right, we should tell them, like, hey, guess what? You just made a new nacho. So I can tell it at nacho. It's equal to nacho.create, and then I can render, right? What did the fetch say it was going to accept? nacho. So now if I'm looking at the fetch should then receive a brand new nacho object. That's exactly what I'm telling it. I'm going to create it and then I'm going to send the brand new nacho I just made back to the front end. So if I do that, how can I test to see what actually came back from this? If I do fetch equals something, I'm always going to get back a promise. Promise. Well, I can take it. I know I'm about to get JSON. So you guys want arrow syntax or the function keyword? Function keyword? Sure. Boop, 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 boop. This is going to get back the response. I'm going to return the response.json. Boop, boop. And then I'm going to get another function. And what should that be? Based exactly on what we learned from Rails. It's going to be the brand new nacho. So I can put nacho man. Nacho man. And if I console log the nacho, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one. And it's going to be Evan, not Evans. I'm going to send that data. It's going to hit the route, hit the post, hit the controller action. The controller action is going to create it, send me back the JSON, and then when I get the response back, I parse it, and then when I get the parse JSON, I'm simply going to log it. So if I click it, eventually, oh, I'm sorry, embarrassing. I'm still in the bug from before. Ridiculous. There, I get the object back. Notice how I get everything back. Do I want to shape this data, or do I want to leave it alone? I could probably shape it, but before I do, let's just talk about how one would do that. How would you do that? Actually, realistically, you could probably do exactly this. Oop. Except this is going to be nacho, right? And then you just render the serialized data. And you know what? I'm already here. You know? Huh?
You won't send it out anything because you did not create a cheese for that, and you just send back the cheese. So
Oh my God, it'll just send me back null. Yeah, embarrassing. Wow, very good. You're on it. Cool. Who feels good about like what just happened? All right, so the idea is that on this click, let's take a look at the front end. On the form submit, I stop the form from like doing its normal thing, which is like sort of like sending a post request that I don't want it to do. I grab the input at this time because now it has the data, right? I send that post request, which is slightly more complicated than the get. And when I send the post, it looks at the route, it looks at the method, it finds that route on Rails. Rails tells it to go to API v1 nachos controller with the action of create. It creates it, and then I simply render that data back. When I send the JSON back to the front end, it finishes the network request. I get the response. I parse the response, and then I know I should be getting that brand new nacho object back, and I simply console log the object. So that all being said, right? If I click to see all the nachos, what should be there? Oh, it's there. Because when I clicked, that's when it pulled the data from the database. Here's the interesting thing. If I make a new one and I send that data, it makes it, but why is the DOM not updated? Right, because I have to click this again to see it, which actually does append child, which is not the best user experience. But now I see it. So now we run into this weird bug where every time I click it, it keeps appending child. So how can we fix that?
I don't know if this is one way, but
It's a way.
What I did in a lab previously was I just like removed all the children first before I built all the new like keys in like a for loop.
What if every time I click the button, it clears it? And it just only appends it. So I make a new one, send that data, and when I click it, it clears it, gets the data, and then throws them back on.
Why is it sending back the entire like did you do the serialize?
Oh, no, actually, I removed that because I didn't make the cheese, so it was just going to send me back null. Yeah, I commented it out. But good point. Damn, you eagle eye. All right, so we finished post, right? We should, at this point, understand the full cycle of post. Who has any questions on fetch with post? Surprise, surprise, patch, not really that different. The idea here is simply, I want to send an update request. What do you think I might want to change? Yeah, I mean, we could be a little bit more specific and use the word method.
That means it's playing.
Oh, it breaks? Oh, that's right, airplay. It's just not as fun. Anyways, yeah, that stinks. Yeah, you change the method, all right? Ugh, boo, bad UI, 1 star. So, yeah, you would change the method. But more specifically, you also have to make sure you have the right route that you're sending it to, which means that the back end has to have the route, has to have the right controller action, and then it's just going to send you back a response. Are there any questions as to like what is actually happening in this full stack of fetch, hitting the Rails API, sending you back a response? I'm not going to like, spoon feed you at this point in the curriculum. The idea is that, look, it's mod 3, all right? This is the end of mod 3 week 1. We're starting to make you more and more independent. What I'd like you to try is, you could pull down this code, bundle install, is try implementing the patch or the update, and then try implementing the delete, right? I think you should know at this point, match the routes, have the controller action, and then make sure you send back a response that you can test. Those are the 3 main things. And so if there are no other questions, that's really all I have for you today.